What's up, everyone? I hope everyone's having a blessed day. Got a video on Blue Lock. As we all know, in the most recent chapters, Nagi has been locked up for Blue Lock, and there's important lessons to take from that. And this video, I believe, can help us all. Let's get straight into the video.
This fall off is just temporary, only to be hit with the reality that it was far too little, far too late. Blue Lock 297 gave us a twist that had my jaw on the floor. A guy who consistently believed, I'll be back soon, I'll get back to how I was, this fall off is just temporary, only to be hit with the reality that it was far too little, far too late. Blue Lock 297 gave us a twist that had my jaw on the floor. The elimination of Nagi Seishiro, who started the arc ranked second, but could only watch himself fall, and unable to find a way back, he fell all the way to 24th, missing the cut.
Still makes no sense how it...
And of course, this was partly a shock.
Just as a quick pet peeve, it still makes no sense how Nagi even got locked off. Kyora has one assist and did nothing else. Nanase I don't even think has an assist in the entire series. Zantetsu doesn't have an assist. So unless these guys are doing some next level play without doing all that, then it makes no sense of Nagi, who's just been generally the catalyst for Manshine, multiple assists and a super goal. It just doesn't make any sense. But I suppose the author just wanted to really just I don't even know. But to me, he will come back. But let's get to it.
We've seen the inhuman skill of this guy, but also because everything seemed to be gearing up towards a comeback. I'll be back on track soon enough was the vibe that he gave off. And usually in a story, you'd expect a character with so much build-up and so much time invested in them to return to form. That, and in just about every other series, the lazy genius character is always able to get away with his laziness on account of his genius. But Blue Lock is not most stories. It has no issue showcasing some very brutal truths, and it was an almost horrifying moment for me when I sat back and saw what had really happened here. I couldn't help but wonder how close I'd been to that at times and whether such a fate awaits me, even as I type out this script. Because although I can't relate to being a football genius, there are some aspects of this story that hit exceptionally hard, which I'll talk about in a bit. But firstly, I want to look at the parallels between Isagi's succeeding whilst failing and Nagi's failing whilst succeeding, because I think it underlines everything that's happened here. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to the Manshine City match, funnily enough, the one against Nagi, up until Isagi's discovery of Metavision, he had very little impact on the game. You know, I remember reading this weekly and people were actually quite frustrated by just how little he was doing. However, after figuring out Metavision, he immediately managed to break past the entirety of Manshine to get a chance on goal. His shot, however, is stolen by Kunigami, and to the rest of the world, especially Kunigami, it looks as though Isagi is failing as such. But whilst Kaiser taunts him and Kunigami reprimands him, Noah, the world's greatest striker, recognizes that Isagi is onto something here, claiming that the ticket to supremacy he's found can take him all the way to me. In short, in terms of his results alone, it appears as though Isagi is failing, but we know otherwise, and so does he. And that's quite a reassuring, very common idea that, you know, you can be doing everything right and just need to keep doing it for the results to come. But what about the other way around? What about someone who seems to be getting results, but if they keep going the way they are, they'll lose them? And that's quite a scary thought, right? Like, how do you even know if that's you? But this, of course, is Nagi, a good way to look at who, to everyone except Jinpachi.
That's good. That's a good way to look at it. Somebody who's only known failure all their life but worked through it will yield a greater result at the end than someone who's experienced everything. All that results is having a greater fall at the end. It's there's really the dichotomy and the opposite of action, which is very interesting explored between Nagi and Isagi.
Appeared to pull off an impossible, barely believable goal in his 5-stage revolver volley. It sent the world into an absolute frenzy about how he was the player of the century, but to Jinpachi, this feat regarded so highly by the rest of the world brought nothing but discomfort. Jinpachi has always placed emphasis on reproducibility, and at first I thought this was basically all he was referring to. I'm going to come back to that point, as well as Chris Prince's talk about a talent withering. But in light of recent chapters, there's clearly a lot more to it. In 299, Jinpachi refers to this goal as a result beyond his talent, claiming that what happened was him proving he can produce results beyond his talent. And just before this, he speaks about how the environment, friends, and rivals can push people beyond their usual talent. The implication being here that this should have been seen as an outlier and not Nagi's usual level of play. And I think the main reason for this is that Nagi was, at least in part, able to get this goal as a result of him and Rio catching their opponents off guard by teaming back up again. Whilst sure, the final steps by Nagi were phenomenal, the process leading up to it and how codependent on each other the pair were was picked up on by the other teams and was never able to happen again.
Of course
Even
not.
Bachira was able to interrupt it, and I don't think we've ever really seen him do anything like that. Nagi seems to have a really hard time linking up with anyone who isn't Rio or Isugi, and as a result, Jinpachi sees Nagi's plays as just luck, an almost dopamine high that he's chasing, instead of approving his actual level of skill. I suppose a comparison would be if someone who absolutely sucks at football like myself played in a few games and at some point by chance happened to score an amazing overhead kick. My shooting, my passing, my dribbling, etc. all sucked, but I just focused on his overhead kick and went, that's my talent, look at what I managed to do. And tried to continue to reproduce that in the following games. Because it was exciting, it got me fired up, and my best friend is saying, damn, when you scored that overhead kick, it was the coolest thing ever. You know, and everyone online is praising me, and I got 82 million yen offer to play professionally, but being able to
One of the worst things you could do, especially if your goal is to continue growing, is having somebody who's always reaffirming you. You need somebody there to push you and really put you back to level head. Like they acknowledge it, yep, you did well, but can we do it again? Can we go harder? Can we go bigger? This is the kind of people you want to run your camp. And probably one of the key lessons regarding Nagi's story, what maybe go under the radar compared to everything. Who you have in your circle and your environment plays a very key factor of how far you can truly go into your goal. So really take into account that.
occasionally do something like that doesn't make me a worthwhile player if the rest of the time I play is terrible. But not only do I never acknowledge that, but my friend keeps trying to set things up so that I get another chance to score the overhead kick, and plays in such a way that I'm never actually forced to improve any of my other attributes, so I don't. And why would I? Because in my mind, I just need to get back to doing another amazing overhead kick. And so I think the point Ego is making here is essentially that his occasional outbursts don't make him a genius when everything else is so lacking. And it all sounds like a really niche thing that none of us are ever likely to really experience, right? I certainly thought the same at first, which is why I've never made a video on Nagi and his struggles in the NEL, but this is where it links into what Chris Prince said before in chapter 170, which really prophesized everything that happened to Nagi. Note how Jinpachi uses that same phrase, withering talent, and has an identical aura to Chris Prince here when he talks about those who don't understand their talent will see it wither away. It's one of my favorite speeches in the entire series. I made a video on it a long time ago, where he essentially talked about how you should understand your own talent, why and how you were able to succeed on the occasions that you did, but also that you should be comfortable in that. For instance, someone who's an excellent sprinter shouldn't try.
Completely agree. The key parts of growth at the end of the day is always reflection. Deconstruct and then reconstruct and then replicate. It's all well and good succeed. It's all well and good like making it and being successful. But if you don't understand in one instance, but if you don't know how and why you did it, how will you be able to recreate it and how be able to scale it up into even greater heights? And that's a big part of why Nagi is and where he is. He's just riding with the flow, the dopamine hits. That's all he's been searching without truly deconstructing everything about his game and then improving upon it layer by layer. It's only so good luck and dopamine effects and being in a flow state can get you. You need the foundations to ground you. That's essentially why I really don't like the idea of of the on his day arguments. This is one of the worst kind of ways to critique a player, I personally think, in football. And it's been very common in players like Pogba in the past. And one of the best examples, I'll never be for it. How are you going to say one person is better than other based off the on his day argument? I'd rather have a person who commits and has a 9 out of 10 performance in 10 games and each game, rather than have one player who has 10 out of 10 plus performances and 7 out of 10 and 5 out of 10 for other ones. Consistency is always going to be better than random acts of genius. But that's just me. Let me know down in the comments below. Which one would you prefer?
Become someone who muscles their way through instead. because they'll never match someone who's a natural at-bat and risk losing their sprinting ability in the process. It's not that you shouldn't work on your weaknesses, but that you shouldn't try to become something that you're not. Even Blue Lock's king of adaptability, Isagi Yoichi, a player who's built his success off analysing what others around him can do, recognises when something just simply isn't for him. For example, when he looked at Kaiser and recognised that Metavision was something he could try and use himself, but a Kaiser impact wasn't. Now, before I get to how all of this applies to Nagi, I'm aware that there's a tinge of irony here in that the other half of the Nagi-Ryo duo is actually someone who can kind of do everything and can just look at someone doing something and, immediately copy it. But obviously he is one of a kind, and it also doesn't mean that everyone else should be trying to do what he does just because he can. But that aside, what never occurred to me until now is that what Prince is saying could also apply to a much broader scale. Not just how you do something, but why and what you even do in the first place. We see Nagi trying a bunch of different things to try and get his fire back, and none of them work. We see him asking players like Bauer and Rin what their reasons for playing were. And the interesting thing is, when Nagi keeps pushing and pushing with his questions, they both eventually reach a point where they don't really have an answer for them. Both their motivations have a tinge of not irrationality, but more kind of unexplainable element to them. Something that they just feel and understand, but could never completely explain to someone else. And if Nagi's intention here was to try and find something he could use for himself to get himself fired up again, then this was simply never going to work. Even Isagi thinks to himself in 297, right before Nagi's defeat, that there's no way to reproduce that fire. It can't always be explained or kind of forced into existence. But there is also a bit of a balance here. I don't think we should just always expect to always be fired up, or that we need an extreme burning desire to start on something. Quite often I found a lot of the joy comes from after you build the skill in something, and I spoke about that in a previous video and how it kind of applies to Nagi, but there's also the flip side of that, in that trying to force yourself to be passionate about something that you're just not never ends well. Just as a bit of my own experience, after I graduated back in 2020, yes, the year COVID hit, and I started looking for a full-time job to move into, it became very clear very quickly that the highest paid entry-level jobs I was seeing were for software developers, but my degree was in maths, not computer science. And so part of me wondered if I should have done that instead. But I've tried to get into coding a few times over the years, just out of curiosity and because I think it's kind of cool, and I've just never been able to sustain an interest in it. So if I had tried to do a degree in that, because, it'd pay me more down the line, I actually don't know if I would have even finished it. On a similar note with YouTube as well, and this is probably a better example actually. Sometimes I'll see a completely different channel niche. For instance, the other day I saw some politics channel. I don't even watch that sort of thing, but it somehow comes up on my feed sometimes. And out of curiosity, I had a look, and now we're getting hundreds of thousands of views a day. And so part of me thought, well, I've never seen an anime channel do that before. But if I was to try and force myself to do that, right, it would have gone terribly. It's something I have zero interest in. And this is where it links back to Nagi, who's been trying to do exactly that.
What is
I spoke in a previous video about how Nagi's fire seems to show up whenever he has a short-term target, which is usually just scoring a goal. But in the middle of the Manshine game, his aim was to defeat Isagi, and shortly afterwards, ended up scoring his infamous 5-stage revolver volley, letting out a celebratory, that's the closest I got to pronouncing that word, yell for the first time. There's no denying this was a huge rush for him, but if we go back just a few chapters, he believed he couldn't beat Isagi in his current state. And he's, frustrated at how trying to be creative and make his own plays, like Chris and Nagi taught him, isn't going particularly well. And as a reminder, because this is the important part, this is the first time he has ever tried to do that. And he's already frustrated by it not going well when he's been trying for about 5-10 minutes. He's not having fun right now, and so he asked Ryo to team back up with him because even though he probably recognizes that it's kind of bad for his development in the long run,
I agree. Just another lesson here is purely because trying something new will always have your body or your mind resisting it. You try to take 2 steps forward, but the world and the circumstances make you backslide and regress. It's in these moments when Nagi had to have pushed himself even further, and then he'd be able to truly grow and have a foundation of where his abilities can stand on and build his ego from there. But the one instance of him struggling and failing, he was like, nope, this is enough, back to where I was. But that's not how growth is at the end of the day. Growth is about embracing the discomfort in the short term and even in the long term at times, and just powering through, being resilient, being creative, being intuitive. As I said, deconstruct and then reconstructing your efforts and understanding where you're going wrong and how you can improve. And bit by bit, you become successful, and bit by bit, you reach your goal. These are all things Nagi should have done, but he didn't. and he aimed to go the last path of least resistance. In the short term, the path of least resistance works. He managed to beat Isagi in the end. But look at the end result. He's kicked out Blue Lock. Why? Because at the end of the day, a building what's not formed on a strong foundation is just waiting to be blown away by the wind. And it's just how it comes.
Makes it easier in the short run because of how skilled Ryo is and how well they work together. An equivalent gaming comparison would be that he's frustrated at being unable to defeat a boss, and so rather than learning how to improve, he'd rather go into the settings and lower the difficulty. And the issue is, once you've done that once, you'll want to do it every single time. Jinpachi would later criticize his team up as the reason Nagi's talent died, and we spoke earlier about how this goal was a result beyond his talent, but there's also this other part here from Jinpachi, that the biggest killer of a prodigy is not loss of hope, despair, or fear, but satisfaction. He also says that Nagi didn't actually have what it takes to win. He just happened to succeed on this one-off occasion, but is still satisfied. And as Jinpachi says, an animal with a full stomach forgets how to hunt. Or in Nagi's case, it's more that he never really learned how to hunt, as we spoke about earlier. You know, there's this huge part of the game that he's just never really learned. Jinpachi points out, Nagi spoke about being the world's best. He found it very easy to talk about it, but he couldn't find the fire to aim any higher than just beating Isugi. And perhaps this isn't entirely his fault. You know, there's obviously a huge amount on the flow state in the series. When a player finds a goal that's difficult enough to excite them without feeling impossible, it leads to this kind of like optimal concentration. Isugi was almost quite lucky in a way. To have Kaiser, a target that filled those conditions perfectly, whereas Nagi didn't really have anyone like that on his team. And also, where Prince is trying to push him to be more creative in his plays, he's having to do that against a top U20 team. That might have just simply been far too difficult for him to do on his first try. Instead, things might have gone differently if he started off playing against a weaker team, like, I don't know, Barker, I'm kidding, or just, you know, like a weaker team. And perhaps if he had that, things might have been different. But I'm still not going to...
Sorry about that, just kind of messed up accidentally. I'm not really sure where we were, so we'll just go from here.
Satisfied him. And as Jinpachi says, an animal with a full stomach forgets how to hunt. Or in Nagi's case, it's more that he never really learned how to hunt, as we spoke about earlier.
Comfort is,
you know, there's this huge part of the game that he's just never really...
Understand that comfort will always be the biggest hindrance to progress and success. Your body will always be resistant against discomfort and wants you to be comfortable. Break through that mindset, embrace the comfortability, push through into adversity, and you'll see how much brighter your future is.
But there's also the fact that, as Jinpachi points out, Nagi spoke about being the world's best. He found it very easy to talk about it, but he couldn't find the fire to aim any higher than just beating Isugi. And perhaps this isn't entirely his fault.
Quite shameless.
You know, there's obviously a huge amount on the flow state in the series. When a player finds a goal that's difficult enough to excite them without feeling impossible, it leads to this kind of like optimal concentration. Isugi was almost quite lucky in a way to have Kaiser, a target that filled those conditions perfectly, whereas Nagi didn't really have anyone like that on his team. And also, where Prince is trying to push him...
It is quite an interesting what-if story if any of the other players went to different teams. And what if Nagi moved to Munich with Isagi? That's a very interesting case. Instead of potentially Shido with Ubers is another what if, but it is true. How decisions, it really makes it quite interesting how small decisions, well, decisions what you consider small, have massive ripple effects on where you could really end up. So really take into account every decision you make if you really want to be the successful and the goal you want.
To be more creative in his plays, he's having to do that against a top U20 team. That might have just simply been far too difficult for him to do on his first try. Instead, things might have gone differently if he started off playing against a weaker team, like, I don't know, Barker, I'm kidding, or just, you know, like a weaker team. And perhaps if he had that, things might have been different. But I'm still not going to absolve Nagi of all responsibility here. And this is the part of the video that some of you guys might have been waiting for me to get to. Because firstly...
Hold up. Charged.
I briefly touched on this earlier, he really didn't even try. You know, it's frustrating to see when he's got all these, like he couldn't ask for a better coach, really, right? He's got the #2 striker in the world coaching him, and he gave this whole making his own plays thing literally one attempt. And then when it didn't work, he gave up on that and beating Isagi. Ironically, back in season 1, when Isagi couldn't see a way to defeat Nagi, because he had no choice but to keep going, he was able to come up with something. But Nagi didn't even really allow his back to go up against the wall, where he might have figured something out if given no other choice. And I know some people blame Ryo for that, but really, like, how was he possibly supposed to know this would happen? And also, there's obviously a lot going on between those two, so personally, I don't blame Ryo at all. But it's no surprise to me that Nagi's fire didn't stick around when he had zero willingness to push through any amount of discomfort. This is exactly what Jinpachi saw in him when he first came to Blue Lock in Chapter 2 of Episode Nagi, in contrast to Isagi, who is extremely willing to keep going and ended up with brain-boiling joy. But the point I'm getting at is, whilst I spoke earlier about how you can't force yourself to care about something, you have to give things a chance. And you have to actually try. If you're like Nagi and you don't put an ounce of effort into anything, then no wonder you don't enjoy anything. No wonder nothing excites you and you feel like you have nothing you're passionate about. A lot of the time, the excitement follows the effort and the little accomplishments, and Nagi should know this. He's experienced this himself. And I know I spoke a bit about this last video, but when I was younger, I was certainly very guilty of just sitting around and not really doing a lot. Because I was waiting for the fire, as such, to kind of just show up, to just land in my lap one day. Guess what? It doesn't happen, right? You've got to actually look for it. And also, when you do find it, the decisions you make can really affect whether it sticks around or not. Obviously, burnout is a big one. If you're going to start working, 16-hour days, then you're probably going to end up hating whatever it is. Obviously, that could not be any more irrelevant for this video on Nagi. But Jinpachi talks about how these two choices affected both his talent and his fire. If him and Ryo made different choices, there's maybe a chance it'd still be him.
Choices in the end,
or at least that's what I thought when I wrote that first chunk of the script before Chapter 300 came out. But having now read it, I'm no longer so convinced that that is true for Nagi. Whilst sure some of the decisions he made may have sped this process up as such, I honestly think football just wasn't for him, which sounds absolutely insane given his skill at it, but the fact that he has no regrets over it at all is very telling. You know how sometimes when you quit, you feel really guilty and awful about it because you know you're just quitting out of laziness or whatever, and
I think this was pretty premature said, as anyone who's up to date with the most recent chapter will literally see Nagi bawling his eyes out, saying how he has all these regrets, how he should have tried much sooner. So a bit premature and a bit short-sighted in that aspect, but maybe that's hindsight because we know the next chapter now.
Sometimes it's just like, yeah, I'm not going to carry on with that anymore. I spoke about this in my video on Haikyuu's Hirogami, which is going to make for another great point when I go around to my video on why Blue Lock and Haikyuu actually agree with each other a lot more than people seem to think. That's a few months off, but anyway, the point being, I don't think quitting as such is always a bad thing. I know Nagi isn't really quitting here, but he's saying, I'm not aiming for #1 anymore, and he's not a bad person for that. Sure, that's not the mindset of someone who will make it in Blue Lock, but if he can genuinely, honestly say to himself that it's just not for him, then so what, right? Why chase after something that you just don't massively care about? And it's probably quite difficult for him to say that when he's seen these moments of genius, right? And he's seen how good he could be at it. So I don't know what the general reaction to this was, but I honestly see little wrong with this. And I like that Ryo sees it the same way. He doesn't blame him. He acknowledges that, like, yeah, this was my idea, not yours. And he just says, hey man, don't apologize, you stuck with it for a very long time, all things considered. However, the reason I say little wrong instead of nothing wrong is partly because of what I said earlier. I don't think he really gave that new style of football that Agi and Prince tried to teach him enough of a chance. Maybe if he did and he started to see some success with it, he would have started to enjoy that. And there is also what he says later on in the chapter about how he wonders that if he wasn't so afraid of losing Ryo, things might have been different. But whilst sure that codependency was a bit of an issue, I think this outcome would have happened regardless. However, there is of course that tiny little fire in his eye after Isagi tells him not to quit. So I still think there's a chance he comes back in the adult World Cup, obviously not the U20 one, if after finally hitting rock bottom like Barrett told him to, he does find a greater reason to keep playing, although honestly with Isugi's trajectory, just beating Isugi would be enough to make him one of the best in the world. But that aside, I do wonder if based on that, he is going to think, hey, maybe I should just keep going and see what happens. Obviously, he still has a very substantial offer from a professional club, so the opportunity for him to continue playing is there if he wants to take it. And by the sounds of it, it would be the first time he's ever actually stuck to something, so either way, it's going to be extremely interesting to see where Nagi's story goes from here. Thank you very much for watching. Special thank you to Yogesh Tendoloka and EJGamer39 for signing.
Very good video. And like I said, the last part is quite premature because as of episode of chapter 301, we know that he's actually still has that fire in him and he does want to play football. We'll see where his story and blood does carry on, but I hope for Nagi's return. But Nagi's return, Nagi's story as a whole is very, very masterclass and something is completely relatable to all of us in the sense of that I feel like we each, those of us who want to be successful, for example, we feel like we have that potential to do so, but we feel like we're waiting for external factors to motivate us, that we'll suddenly find one thing and then everything will go from there. That's not how success works. That's not how life works. Life is only rewards those who put in the work, who try, who are willing to endure hardship, setbacks, and resistances, and have that ultra competitive mindset and belief in themselves that they're going to win over everyone else. And these are all things that Nagi lacked. In contrast, he acts perfectly in contrast to Isagi, who is all these things. So ultimately, it is a case that the lesson is really showing us that we have to really look at Nagi as a real manual of what not to do, because at the end of the day, all you're going to have is regrets and sorrow. All these what if stories of if only I tried that, if only I put more effort in, if only I had made this decision. A life of regret is a life of misery. Those who try, I promise you at the end, you will be the one smiling. So if that's you right now in a position where you feel like I don't know what to do, or I can't do it, or I'm scared, or I'm looking for motivation, that's all just noise. Silence the noise, lock in, focus, and push through. You can do it. Good luck. And that's from me, from Blessed Reacts, signing out. Like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, ciao.